We can mask on the outside what we're living on the inside. And even those who are close to us, others who are close to us, can be unaware of the pain that we're trying to keep from leaking out. As Suzanne said, I was the recipient of a divine intervention, actually 26 years ago today. 26 years ago today. Our second child, Libby, was born 15 weeks premature, weighing less than 2 pounds. And on the way to the hospital, I'd already had one. I had a son who was 2, and I knew they were contractions, and I thought, it was the middle of the night. I thought, this isn't going to be a big deal, because I'll get to the hospital, and they'll stop my contractions, and maybe they'll put me on bed rest. But when the doctor said, I'm sorry, you're dilated to 4, and we can't stop your labor, then my life changed irrevocably that night. Libby is 26 years old today. And a result of her prematurity, she has severe cerebral palsy. She is unable to walk or to talk, although she seems to understand everything. And due to an initial brain hemorrhage that she had with her prematurity, she developed fluid on the brain and has shunts in her brain to drain that fluid, which have resulted, fast forward 26 years later, to a stroke and 79 surgeries. And I tell people, it's like UPS shows up at your door with a package that you didn't order. But it has your name on it. And so you have to sign for it. And in the return address, it says from God. And so you have to accept it into your life. You have to bring it into your home. And if the box is all beaten up, you've had packages like that delivered, the box is all beaten up. But if you throw the box away because it's all beaten up, you never get the gift that's inside. And I want to share with you, this is from a very old, oops, there are my glasses, that's probably better. Who knows what this message will be about today now? I have that bad habit, I keep them on my head, I can never find them at the house, so that's very typical. In the devotion Streams in the Desert, which actually is from 1925, so it's an old devotion. A pastor, A.B. Simpson, shares, sometimes diamonds are done up in rough packages so that their value cannot be seen. When the tabernacle was built in the wilderness, there was nothing rich in its outward appearance. The costly things were all within. And its outward covering of rough badger skin gave no hint of the valuable things which it contained. God may send you, dear friends, some costly packages. Do not worry if they're done up in rough wrappings. You may be sure that there are treasures of love and kindness and wisdom hidden within them. If we take what he sends and trust him for the goodness in it, even in the dark, then we shall learn the meaning of the secret of providence. And this brings us to our first point, which is that God is sovereign over all the circumstances in our lives. And what do we mean by that? The biblical context of his sovereignty means that all things, not most things, not some things, but all things are under God's rule and control, and that nothing, absolutely nothing, happens without his direction or permission. God works not just some things, but all things according to the counsel of his will, not mine. That's why we have to surrender. So let's begin by taking a look at the lives of 3 men in the Bible. And I know you just finished the series on Jonah. Libby and I were able to watch all 6 of the DVDs. It was a great teaching. But in the 2nd chapter of Jonah, verses 1 and 2, Jonah's talking to God. And he says, you threw me into the deep. Now, we know physically that it was the sailors on board that picked Jonah up and threw him overboard. So why is it that Jonah, in talking to God, would say, you threw me into the deep? It's because Jonah was keenly aware of the presence of God in the circumstances, and he acknowledged his sovereignty. And as we read about Joseph, we're told that, the story, he was thrown into the pit by his brothers. He was sold as a slave. He was later imprisoned falsely. And when Jonah is speaking in the 45th chapter of Genesis, verse 5, He's talking to his brothers after he's revealed who he is, and he says, "Don't be angry with yourselves that you did this to me, for God did it." God did it. He sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Not only was Joseph aware of the presence of God, but he also saw his purposes in it. He knew his brothers had caused that, but he credited God with allowing it to happen for a greater purpose. Now I just want to stop for a second so we don't get off track and misunderstand. I just want to clarify that I'm not saying that God causes everything in our life. I'm not saying God causes anything evil or anything bad, but he makes those things happen. Certainly by our own choices, myself included, by our own choices and the actions that we take and the actions of other people. And we're in a fallen world because of death and disease. Our lives can get interrupted and derailed, and for some of us forever altered. But what I am saying, and this is what I really want to send home today with us, is that God is not so much concerned with how the events come into our lives, but rather how we're going to respond once they do. And I personally believe that the source of affliction is secondary. With Jonah, the source of affliction was himself. He ran, didn't he? Caused his circumstances. With Joseph, the source of affliction were his brothers, people other than himself. And with Job, the source of affliction is Satan. It's the enemy. In one day, if you can imagine, in one day, God allows Satan to destroy all of Job's livestock, and he was a very wealthy man. You can picture the hills with thousands and thousands of sheep and cattle and oxen and donkeys. Many of his servants lost their lives, and all 10 of his children in one day. My suffering doesn't come close to that. And as if that wasn't enough, we know that the next day God allows Satan to strike Job physically and to give him a severe case of open sores from head to toe. So whether it's ourselves or the actions of others or that of the enemy, what matters to God is our response to the trial. The very fact of trial proves that there is something in us very precious to our Lord, or else he would not spend so much pain and time on us. So what are you facing today? I know some of you, many of you, but I don't know what's on the inside that we can mask over. What are you facing now, either today or in the past, that seems more than difficult? It may even seem impossible. There was one such neurosurgery that seemed impossible for Libby. Her surgeon gave us a 90% chance of her dying in the surgery. He said that he'd had patients who had died before on the operating table, but never, ever knowing ahead of time that they would. That's how confident he was that if he had to take her to surgery, she would die. And it did come to pass. Actually, it was the day before her birthday. It was November 14th. It was several years ago. And as he tried to remove this tubing, the shunt that had become scarred down to her brainstem, and as you know, that's the part of our brain that controls all our vital signs, our vital functions, all the breathing and heart rate. As he tried to remove this tube that had gotten scarred down and was infected and had to come out, he said he gently pulled on it and her heart rate plummeted down to 30, and he had to stop. He said, but I paused, and something told me to try again. Now he knew if he tried again that she could die on the table. But he did. And he said, I tried again, and it slid right out. And he came to us in the waiting room, and as he told us this, keep in mind, it's a neurosurgeon. He said, I know I didn't do this. You see, God did the seemingly impossible to display himself to her surgeon in that moment. The Reverend Chase Inwood has said, when God is going to do something wonderful, he begins with a difficulty. And if it's going to be something very wonderful begins with an impossibility. And I know your circumstances feel like that at times, mine do. These interruptions, these divine interventions, usually come with pain sufficient to get our attention. It's the phone call, it's the diagnosis, it's the family member, it's the wayward son or daughter, it's the foreclosure, it's, whatever difficulty. It's unique as we are. But what then? Where do we turn? That's really the second point, is that we have a choice when these things interrupt our lives. That we can deny it, we can drink it, drug it, eat it, we can try to run from it as Jonah did, or we can let it destroy us. But we have a choice. And I think of what I've told our two sons and just shared over the years is that we don't get to choose what comes into our life all the time. But we do get to choose how we're going to handle it. It can make us bitter, or it can make us better. And in Jonah, chapter 2, 7 through 9, Jonah says to God, when I had lost all hope, and I know that you have been there because I've been there many, many times. I have cried so hard in the hospital that I didn't want to be in the presence of anyone, and so I went to the parking lot, in my car, on my knees, in my van, crying. When I have lost all hope. And keep in mind that Jonah at this point had lost everything. He's in the belly of the fish. It's a dark, I won't describe the conditions, but he'd lost everything. And he had the possibility of losing his life. And he says, when I lost all hope, I turned my thoughts once more to the Lord. And my earnest prayer went to you in your holy temple. I will never worship anyone else but you. For how can I thank you enough for all you have done? Then, I think it's interesting that after the thanksgiving, then the Lord orders the fish to spit up Jonah. So where did Jonah turn when he didn't have hope? He turned to the Lord. And in the difficult places, we have a choice. You see, both Judas and Peter betrayed Christ. The difference being that Judas ran away from Christ, and Peter ran back to him. So what then when we've lost all hope? In 2009, which wasn't that long ago, Libby was hospitalized for 6 months at Lutheran General Hospital. She had 17 neurosurgeries and 6 different separate brain infections. At one point, her neurosurgeon approached me in the intensive care unit and said, I have to question why we're still treating her. And I'm not the only one. Of course, I was, at my lowest, weakest point, and I was in her room, and her primary care physician stopped by. And I know he was well-intended. And he was trying to encourage me that there are other forms of healing. That if Libby were to die, her suffering would be over, that there are other forms of healing. And seeing the look on my face, he said, Susie, what is it that you need from us? And I said, I need honest, accurate medical information, but please be kind about it. Don't shoot me with something really direct. And I said, and you want me to trust you with that? And I said, I want you to know that my relationship with my God is so intimate that I am not going to be the last one to know. Nobody is going to have to say, who's going into Mrs. Watts' room and tell her that Libby is dying. That I'm not saying that God has to heal Libby. I am not saying that if he doesn't, I think anything differently of him. But I am saying he can. He can heal Libby. And I am going to wait on him. And I realize that the window of her life is closing. And that if she makes it through this, it will be by the hand of God. But I want you to trust me spiritually. The 6th infection was the worst to come. And the doctors told me that there was only one antibiotic left that could treat this bacteria that was growing in her brain. And they would inject it not into the vein, the IV in her arm, but directly through the drain in her head, in her brain. So as she fell asleep, I went down again to the hospital chapel. I was a very frequent visitor there. And there I am, crying out to the Lord, saying, God, again, only this time, it is a Goliath infection. It is a Goliath infection, and there's only one stone left in the bag. To which his spirit told me, Susie, it only took one to kill Goliath. And at the point when hopelessness was knocking at my door, it was his spirit that provided the hope. And let's look at Joseph. You know, Joseph, who for a total of 13 years had served as a slave to Potiphar, was thrown in prison. And he was put in charge of all the other prisoners and all the other responsibilities because people could see that the Lord was with him. And even after that chief cupbearer forgot all about Joseph in prison, 2 more years passed. But Joseph remained faithful in prison, faithful in his circumstances, because he had turned to the Lord. And Job, when all of his children had died, can you imagine? He tore his robe, he shaved his head, and he fell to the ground in worship. And after he received the physical affliction from the hand of Satan, he said those famous words, shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Job fell to the ground in worship. So what happens when we choose to turn back to God and we trust Him in the midst of our trials, of what you're living through? Well, we're given an opportunity, and I loved how Priscilla said this in the DVD, we're given an opportunity to participate in a supernatural event with God. It's when we get to personally experience His power, and what's being lived out, if you can imagine, in your life, is really on an eternal stage, and it's of eternal consequence.